Archery plays a big role in every Zelda game, which makes sense. It is a bit of a medieval fantasy game after all, so bows are a must. However, throughout these games, we come across a lot of different types of arrows, with some having extraordinary abilities that almost seem impossible. So what powers these arrows? Who made them? And what happens to those that are struck by ancient arrows? Well, let's find out. Now, the bow and arrow has been seen in the Zelda titles since the very first game, where these arrows have what seems to be a broad head design. They are especially good at inflicting high damage on a soft target, because they have a big cutting blade at the front, and also hooks at the back, making it very hard to pull it out without dealing immense damage to yourself. However, one thing that they're not really good at is armor penetration. The broader head makes it more difficult for the entire arrowhead to go through armor, unless it's made of cloth, leather, or something similar, because at the end of the day, it is really good at cutting. However, in later games, we can also see that the style of arrow is changing, with a bodkin tip being featured in titles like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. These are better for armor penetration, because they have a smaller surface area and can pierce through hard objects. Think of steel, for example. However, sadly enough, when it comes to normal arrow types, none of this is acknowledged. While some might have a broad head design with barbs, and others look more like a bodkin tip, they don't have a specific effect on certain enemies or enemies with armor. So while in the real world these two arrow types would have a completely different effect on your enemy, in The Legend of Zelda this isn't acknowledged at all. But still, throughout the games, from the very first Legend of Zelda to Ocarina of Time, the bow is featured, with normal arrows either having a bodkin or a broadhead design. And especially the one seen in the Wind Waker looks extremely nasty to be hit by. However, aside from these rather mundane types of arrows, we also see another that seems to be normal but is much more powerful than most would think: the silver arrows, which deal more damage, but in many ways that doesn't make a lot of sense, because silver is a relatively soft metal, making it very inefficient at penetrating armor, bone, and other hard materials. However, we did receive them from magical entities like a cursed fairy in A Link to the Past, so it seems like they have some sort of magical power. However, it could also be that Nintendo is following folklore rules here. As we all know, historically, monsters like werewolves were weak to silver. This was one of the only materials that was able to kill these monsters. And it seems like in The Legend of Zelda, the effect is similar, with silver dealing more damage to evil monsters such as Ganon, where it's even required to actually beat him. However, there's one other relatively normal arrow type that doesn't seem to be magical that packs quite a punch, and is very different from the others in the franchise. I'm talking about the bomb arrows, which were first seen in Link's Awakening. Here, Link can shoot bomb arrows by equipping both the bow and bombs and using them at the same time. Now, of course, this arrow type also made appearances in later titles such as Spirit Tracks, Twilight Princess, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and many others. Overall, they're very powerful and extremely useful, not only for destroying enemies, but also getting rid of any obstacles that Link might face during his quest. And figuring out where Hylians got the inspiration for this new arrow type is not too difficult, because weirdly enough, in the world of The Legend of Zelda, there are a lot of enemies that are explosive. This is something I would love to cover in a future video, so we might get back to this subject at some point. But as we have seen in the many Legend of Zelda games, from Majora's Mask to Twilight Princess, there are loads of creatures that have inherent explosive powers. Think of bombling or the real Bombchus, which the Hylians already used as inspiration for creating mechanical Bombchus, which are moving explosives that are kind of weird. For some reason, these creatures have the biological power of literally self-destructing, exploding with an immense amount of force. Now, it's never explained in the franchise why they're able to do this or how this works, but I can imagine that the Hylians did notice them, and in time figured out how they functioned and what chemical makeup they have, allowing them to make their own version of gunpowder, which led to the introduction of explosives and even stuff like cannons in the world of The Legend of Zelda. And so the famous bomb arrows were born. Just take a normal arrow, strap some explosives to it, and shoot it at your target, and watch them be destroyed in a matter of milliseconds. Now these are some of the most powerful normal arrow types in the Zelda franchise that don't necessarily require magic. However, there are some out there that are a lot more powerful. In later Legend of Zelda titles, like Ocarina of Time, we all of a sudden encounter certain arrow types that seem to be magical. For example, in Ocarina of Time, the fire arrows are obtained in Lake Hylia as an adult, and in order to get them, Link must stand on top of the plaque above the water temple's entrance and shoot an arrow at the sun just as it begins to rise. At that point, the arrow will freeze in mid-air and fall onto an island on the lake, where Link can pick it up, granting him the ability to use fire arrows. Clearly, all of this is magical in a way. The power of the sun was imbued into this arrow, creating a fire arrow. In Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and The Wind Waker, fire arrows are clearly magical. Link powers up normal arrows with his magical abilities of fire. And the same goes for other types like the ice arrows. Although here we do not have to create them ourselves. Somehow the Gerudo were able to create ice arrows, which is still a bit of a mystery to me, but the ice arrows in general are not really used in Ocarina of Time. However, all of this does show that these arrows aren't inherently magical. Link makes them magical. That's at least what it seems like. However, the game also offers contradicting evidence with the in-game designs. Because if we look at the fire arrow or ice arrow, we can see that there's some sort of gemstone around the head of the arrow. And this reminds me a lot of what we would see in later Zelda titles. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, these elemental arrows changed, both their design and kind of how they function. We can see that the tips of arrows were replaced with elemental rocks, carved into the design of an arrowhead. And these embody the magical power of these gemstones. The power comes from rocks that seem to be imbued with elemental power, but it is never explained in-game how that is possible. But according to in-game text, they have been around since ancient times. Now we can see that these arrowheads are carved in a certain shape. And at first, I thought that this was very important for harnessing their elemental energy. But as we have seen in Tears of the Kingdom, where you can literally fuse any kind of item to an arrow, this isn't necessarily needed for these elemental gems to exude their power upon hitting an enemy. So I started thinking, what made these stones so powerful? One answer I came up with is the Dragons of Hyrule, since they embody those specific powers. So it could be that their elemental powers were drawn into these gemstones or rocks, leaving residual energy inside of them. But there's also another creature that could have played a role in this: the stone taluses. These stone giants also harness elemental power, so maybe they deposited some of that when coming into contact with them. It's clear that some things in the Legend of Zelda universe can absorb power. I mean, the Choo-Choos are also a great example. So maybe a similar thing happened to these gems, or just normal rocks, turning them into these elemental gems. But in general, Nintendo gave us very little information about this, so all of this is a bit vague. However, there are two other arrow types left that are even more powerful than any of the others we have mentioned, and their origins are even more mysterious. When Link sets out on his quest in Ocarina of Time to defeat the evil Ganondorf and stop the end of the world, Zelda helps him in many ways. And the last thing she does for him is give him the light arrows. These arrows possess the sacred light that can pierce and destroy evil itself without any effort. And in many ways they are very similar to the silver arrows seen in games like A Link to the Past. Clearly these are the upgraded version of them. You gotta remember, back during the the days of Ocarina of Time, Nintendo was still trying to figure out the exact background story and lore of the Legend of Zelda franchise. So we saw a lot of retcons. Now it's clear to me that these arrows were created by the gods themselves, the golden goddesses or their servants that try to keep Hyrule safe and prevent the Triforce from falling into the hands of evil. In many ways, I can imagine that their power is similar to the light spirits from Twilight Princess. Pure light that pierces through the darkness no matter what. That's at least how I see it. Now it's clear that they're not available for everyone. They're rare, they're godly, they're the ultimate weapon of the golden gods against those who want to end the Triforce experiment that is Hyrule. And so, only those who are worthy are able to obtain them. However, what powers them is a bit vague. In some games, like Ocarina of Time, we once again see some sort of gemstone around the head of the arrow. But we have never ever seen any gem or precious stone in the franchise that actually holds light energy. So we have no idea what material this exactly is. Meanwhile, in titles like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the arrows don't really matter. The thing that powers them with light is the bow itself. So it seems like godly figures are able to create arrows made out of pure light, which might actually explain why the gemstones seen around the arrow heads in Ocarina of Time aren't encountered in the real world anywhere, because only gods can create them, and so they aren't naturally found in the world of Hyrule. But we have one other arrow type that we need to look at that is also rather special. I'm of course talking about the ancient arrows, which are some of the most insane items you will come across in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. They are daggers made from ancient technology that were repurposed as arrows by Robbie, who created them about 40 or 50 years after the Great Calamity. Now, as you can imagine, these arrows deal an insane amount of damage, and can even get rid of a guardian in one shot. Now, if you use it on other enemies or weaker bosses, you will see that this weapon will completely disintegrate them in seconds. And when you do this, they will also not drop any materials whatsoever. So how do these arrows function? Well, as far as I understand it, they are a combination of ancient Sheikah technology and also magic, because the description of the arrow says the following: to be struck with one is to be consigned to oblivion in an instant. It deals devastating damage even against guardians. Now, if you see an enemy get hit by one of these arrows, it almost looks like he's being teleported to a completely different place. And this is also what makes the most sense to me. It would explain why the enemies do not drop items when you hit them with one of these. But where exactly do they go? Well, throughout the franchise, we have seen that there are other worlds, and also something known as the gap between dimensions, which Phantom Ganon is sent to in Ocarina of Time. So I think if you hit an enemy with an ancient arrow, they will be sent to some other realm. Either the gap between dimensions, a place like the Twilight Realm, maybe Lorule, just somewhere that isn't Hyrule. This way, you do not have to deal with them. That's also why I think these arrows are a combination of both Sheikah technology and ancient magic. That way, they can deal insane amounts of damage and also transport somebody to a completely different world, getting rid of the problem. But again, Nintendo never explained where exactly these enemies go. So it's clear that in the Legend of Zelda universe, arrows are very diverse. Sometimes the Hylians create arrows from normal materials such as steel, and then other times seemingly magical or supernatural materials such as gems are used. And other times the gods or other divine creatures like fairies bestow them upon heroes such as the light arrows and silver arrows. Clearly you have a diverse range to choose from. But let me know in the comments down below which one is your favorite. Aside from that, I got a bunch of other videos here on the channel that you can check out, so be sure to have a look. And also, I stream here on YouTube every Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, and be sure to subscribe. That way, you won't miss any future videos.